This is where we left off at the end of chapter 1 of Revelation. And so when John sees Jesus, here's his best friend that he hasn't seen in decades, probably. And so, but he sees him in his glorified form, which is very scary. And so he says he fell down like a dead man. And Jesus comes and puts his hand on his shoulder. And he says, do not be afraid. And he says, write these things which you have seen, and things which are, and the things which take place after these things. And then he tells him that he is going to give him messages for these 7 churches. And then, so today we're going to go through chapters 2 and 3. And in those chapters, Jesus gives 7 specific messages to these 7 churches. And so he's basically Jesus is dictating letters to John that John is writing down to send to these churches. So let's talk about these churches. What are these churches? Oh, and how amazing is it that these churches, these are real churches that existed at the time, that they are going to receive letters that were dictated personally from Jesus. Is that not amazing? How wonderful would it be for your church to receive a letter that was personally dictated by Jesus Christ? That is just awesome. Okay, so let's talk about these 7 churches, because who are they? What are these churches? Why these churches? Okay, so if you look at this map, so you can see the island of Patmos. This was where John was located at the time, and that is in this purple circle down here in the bottom left, okay, corner. And so Patmos actually belonged to Greece. It was part of Greece. And in this map, you can't see Greece because it's off to the left, off the side of the map here. Okay, and the island of Patmos is in the Aegean Sea. And the 7 churches that Jesus is going to give messages to are in these red circles. So they weren't in Greece. They were in a place that was called Asia Minor at the time, which is today's Western Turkey. And so all 7 of those churches, you can see them in those red circles right there. Okay, so why these 7 churches? Nobody's really sure. I read through all kinds of suggestions from different people. So somebody said, oh, it's because they were in a circle. Okay. Somebody said it was because these were postal districts in the Roman province of Asia. That makes sense, because then John was going to send them letters. So then I'm sure those letters would have been distributed to other churches. And so it would have been easy for them to send those letters on if they were postal districts. I think, this is my personal opinion, and I didn't see this anywhere else. Who knows? But I think that these churches were probably some of the closest churches to where John was at the time, because you can see his island, where he's at, on Patmos Island, and then see these churches here. Now, there certainly were many, many more Christian churches in existence at this time. But Jesus, for some reason, chose just these 7 churches. So we don't know exactly why. But one thing that everybody does agree about is that the number 7 is very significant. That the fact that he chose 7 churches, that is very meaningful, because the number 7, as you all probably know, it represents the perfection of God. It represents completion. And what we see in the book of Revelation is the completion of the work of Jesus Christ in our human timeline. So it's very appropriate that Jesus chose 7 churches. And by doing that, because of the significance of the number, he was implying that it was not just to messages to these specific churches, but to the complete body of Christ. So the messages that he gives to these churches are for all of us. And indeed, at the end of every one of these letters, Jesus says, to the one who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So I think it's obvious that these were personal messages to these individual churches, but also they were a message to the entire body of Christ throughout time. So a lot of times when people do studies of Revelation, they kind of skip over the letters in chapters 2 and 3, but they're missing so much good stuff. There is so much profound messages to us today. And so I didn't want to skip it. And so I'm actually really excited about a lot of the stuff that I've discovered as I've been studying more deeply. So, another thing about the letters. So, I've been going through, as I'm going through Revelation, I have been comparing and contrasting the premillennialism, end times timeline, which is people who believe in the rapture and the 7 years coming tribulation, all of that. And I've been contrasting it with the partial preterist end times timeline, which is what I believe. And, I'm not going to go through it all right now. So just if you're interested and you've missed those videos, you can go back. But I'm not really going to do a lot of compare and contrast of those two timelines today, because we don't really disagree very much about the 7 letters. There's only one point of disagreement, and that is some premillennialists believe that these 7 letters to these 7 churches represent 7 different timelines in the history of the church. Okay, so starting with the first letter would be, which was Ephesus, would have been when Jesus came in the vision to John. So when John was writing Revelation, and then the 7 different ages, ending with the last church, which would be Laodicea, the lukewarm church. And so if you follow that, if you believe that way, then we would be that last church, the lukewarm church. A lot of people could argue that is true, but there is nothing in all of these 2 chapters and anything that Jesus says to indicate and suggest that that is the case. No, what I believe and what I've found that most scholars believe and say about this is that these were written to actual churches that existed in Paul's day. In fact, Paul was probably very intimately familiar with all 7 of these churches. He had probably visited all 7 of these churches. He probably knew the pastors of these churches. He probably knew most of the Christians who went to these churches. So they're personal letters. Jesus did a very, very personalized thing by sending these letters to these churches through John.